All right. This is another in our series on the parables. It is Matthew 20. We're actually also going to get some snippets from Matthew 19. This parable is called The Laborers in the Vineyard. And we go back to 19 because I think I mention this every time that I'm teaching the parables, that it was a revelation for me going through these parables. And I don't know why, but I always assumed that Jesus just knew all these stories, right? It was like a gun belt he had on, and he could just whip out whichever one was applicable. And that is not the case. Every one of these parables comes from a context of a situation that happened before where he sees somebody's heart or their behavior, and he decides that this is a teachable moment, to coin an obnoxious phrase that's overused, especially in education, where everyone misses the teachable moment. But the teachable moment for Jesus is to reveal to somebody that they're not applying the good news of the gospel in their own life. And they can't see it when you just tell them. But if you tell them a story about somebody else and then explain it, all of a sudden they can see it because they're one step removed. So let's see how much trouble everybody gets in just being a laborer in the vineyard. All right, chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of an estate who went out in the morning at dawn to hire workmen for his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. So there's a lot there all of a sudden. So Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is like an estate owner who has a vineyard. And he goes out early in the morning to hire workmen to work in his vineyard. Okay? All kinds of things need to be done in the agriculture of wine. And so he constantly needs workers. And he constantly goes to the city square, much like in big cities. There's always a place where workers congregate, normally outside paint stores or outside lumber yards, wherever. And this started thousands of years ago. So there's all these guys who are agricultural workers, and they're in that square before dawn so that they can get a day's work and feed their families. So then once he sees them, then they negotiate. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius, which was a full day's pay, he sent them into his vineyard. We're all with that program, right? And he went out about the third hour, 9 a.m. So he hires them at 6 a.m. Then he goes back to the square at 9 a.m. and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right, an appropriate wage." And they went. So these people who are starting later, they don't have the contract. They didn't negotiate for a day's wage like the people at 6 a.m. did. The people at 6 a.m. wanted to know they were going to get a full day's wage for that work. These people at 9 a.m., he doesn't negotiate with them. He goes, "You go work and I'll pay you whatever is right." And they went. So we know that Jesus is not talking about how you can be a good wine vineyard worker. He's saying this is about the kingdom of heaven, okay? And the estate owner is God. And these workers who are in the marketplace, well, those are believers, right? And God wants believers doing kingdom work. He wants them working in his vineyard. His vineyard is the church of Jesus Christ. So this is what he's looking for. And he continues to go to this marketplace. So he goes once at 6, makes the invitation. negotiates with them, pays them. He goes again at 9, makes the invitation and says, you go and I'll pay you what's right. So then he goes out at the 6th hour, which is noon. This is his 3rd trip to this marketplace. And the 9th hour at 3 p.m., his 4th trip, and did the same thing. In other words, I'll hire you and I'll pay you what is right. And about the 11th hour, 5 p.m., means there's only 1 hour left in the workday. Okay, so back then, you started work at 6 a.m., you finished work at 6 p.m., and you got paid your money for that day. Deuteronomy calls that out. It says, you must pay that wage at the end of the day because that's the workman's hope while he's going through everything it takes to work that 12-hour day. He needs to know that he can finish, go buy food, whatever's needed, show up at home. Do Christians do that? You know they don't. You're asking a rhetorical question. You know they don't. They go in and out of the church, they backslide. Yes. And actually, it's probably better to say that the people in the square have the opportunity, right? And so what we're supposed to see in this is that God is constantly making the invitation. And so when you see that he goes out 5 times during the day and makes the invitation, that's supposed to make you think, how many times did God make the invitation to me and I kept rejecting it and he kept offering? How many times have people invite you to go to church with them, invite you to a Wednesday night supper, invite you to a Bible study? How many times did something show up in your mailbox, right? A tract, a monthly study, all of these ways that God is reaching out, okay? We're supposed to look at that and say, wow, that is a benevolent landowner. That is somebody who is constantly coming to us. And if we're honest about it, almost none of us took the first invitation. I rejected it for almost 40 years. Oh, no, got something better to do. No, I need to take care of something. That's going to be a distraction. No, it seems too goofy to me. It's not immediate. I need straight A to B, all that kind of thing. Just constantly rejected it. And there are Christians, not real Christians, but people who go to church who basically say, you know what? I'll do this kingdom thing for 1 hour a week. And then the rest of the week, I live as if I don't know any of that exists. And then I come back for 1 hour on Sunday. Okay. So we all get it. We get what this marketplace is and what God is doing, going to it. And then when we see there are people who started at 6 a.m. and there are people who started at 5 p.m. and only worked 1 hour. What does that mean? It means it doesn't matter if you accepted Jesus when you were 5 or 95. Some people accept Jesus Christ on their deathbed. We have the penitent thief on the cross next to Jesus saying, please remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. That's it. That's the 5:55 p.m. or no, the 5:55 p.m. worker, right? So many Christians make that human assessment. Oh, is that the deal that you can get in? You can slide in the last 5 minutes and get the same reward? Well, I'm going to do that. I'm going to raise hell for 50 years, maybe 60 years, and then I'll come around to it. And what's the only problem with that plan? We never know when that day is. We never know when that day is. So that doesn't work. People may think it works, and there's probably a whole group going to hell who tried to work that plan. It's like, even finance people say you can't time the market, okay? And that's what those Christians are doing. I'm going to time the salvation market, and it's not going to work. So he comes at 5 p.m. and he found others standing around. So what does that mean? That means that he came to that marketplace. Everyone knows he's an employer when he shows up at that marketplace. And he came, this is his 5th time today. And every time he comes there, he hires people. And for whatever reason, these people who got hired at 5, they were standing around, is the way Jesus describes it. And then he goes, why have you been standing here idle all day? That word idle is significant. Okay? Let's say in a marketplace, maybe those guys that didn't even get there till 9 or between 9 and 10, and they started playing dice in the shade, and maybe there was some warm beer available. And you know what? I'm making a couple bucks here playing dice. Maybe that's better than being out in the hot sun. They're trying to decide if there's another way to accomplish this task. But God sees it differently. He's saying, if you're not working in my vineyard, I'm not valuing the work you're doing. Your secular work is absolutely idleness as far as I'm concerned. And we go, oh, wait a minute. I have to provide for my family and I have to, all this stuff, right? Because that's what we consider our value while we're here. And Jesus is saying, yeah, no, that's not it. It is the work that you do for the kingdom that God values. Everything else is idleness. And we don't accept that paradigm. Even as Christians, most of us don't accept that paradigm. And guess what? He's not asking for half-hearted church volunteer stuff. You know the routine. Oh, this church that constantly asks me to do things. He's asking for people to really put the work in. And the way you put the work in is by using the spiritual gifts he gives you. That's what God's looking for. And so Jesus, in this situation, is showing us this. He's saying he found them standing around. That's how he sees the secular work. And he goes, why have you been standing here idle all day? They answered, because no one hired us. Disingenuous. We all know what the kingdom work is. We all know because the pastors asked, the church can show where it needs things. He told them, you go into the vineyard also. Everybody get it? Okay. When evening came, okay, so this is now 12 hours into this endeavor, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And the Old Testament law from the Pentateuch was absolutely stiff on this. And it was, even Malachi said, do not mess with the workers and their wages. If they worked, they got to get paid when the work is finished. When evening came, that means the end of your life. So the symbol here is that 12-hour workday is the span of your life. And so now evening comes, and the owner of the vineyard said to his manager is Jesus Christ. Call the workers and pay them for their wages. In other words, get them all in here and let's assess who did what, and let's give them their reward. The reward is salvation. The denarius represents salvation. Okay, so call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last to be hired and ending with the first to be hired. Okay, this is a recurring theme in his parables and in his teaching. The last will be first, the first will be last. So those who had been hired at the 11th hour, 5 p.m., they only worked 1 hour. They came and received a denarius, each a day's wage. Now, when the first to be hired came, they thought they would get more. But each of them also received a denarius. Now, this is the conflict point in this parable. And we all recognize it because there's a part in each and every one of us that goes, hey, wait a minute. That's not fair. Certainly is fair. He negotiated with that group and they said, we'll work all day for a denarius. And he goes, great, I'll pay you a full day's wage. That's your deal. Nobody else got that deal. Everybody else worked and was told, I'll pay you what I think is fair. And they went ahead and worked without a negotiated contract. Now these people come in, they see that somebody who worked 1 hour got paid the same, and now they don't like the deal, but they negotiated the deal, and they got paid fairly for the deal. So now let's talk about that and why Jesus would set this story up this way. Who's he trying to target here? He's trying to target the apostles because the apostles are full of all of this awful part of our human behavior, which is constantly comparing ourselves. Who got more? It starts when you're a little kid, right? You go to a birthday party, they're cutting up the cake. Who gets the big piece? Who got a smaller piece, right? There's always a kid crying because he didn't get as big a piece as somebody else or a bigger scoop of ice cream on his plate. It starts so early and it can, my gosh, does it continue into adulthood? It tears apart churches. It tears apart businesses. It tears apart governments. I'm worth more than those people. That's the whole thing here. These guys who showed up at 6, they're saying, we're more valuable to this operation. Therefore, we get more. And Jesus is not saying, hey, this is an easy thing to walk out throughout the world. He's saying specifically to the apostles, you guys at the Last Supper, they're all going to be going, well, who's gonna be the boss when you're gone? Who's going to be the chief? And he's saying, if you behave like this, it's going to tear everything up. So let's just review here. God expects real workers, not half-hearted workers. The payment here is represented by eternity. And the cost for that payment, what it took to get that payment, is the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. We see that God is constantly making the invitation, and those not in the vineyard working are considered to be idle. And God sees all human endeavor as gross idleness in contrast to the vineyard work. God calls constantly, but Satan constantly distracts. So most of the time, the call doesn't get heard. Sometimes it does get heard, but people don't believe. Or they may believe and get distracted by sin. So now we're going to jump back to why Jesus is telling this to the disciples. What happened to make him invent this parable of the workers in the vineyard? We go to Matthew 19, 23 to 30, context for the vineyard work. This is after Jesus deals with the rich young ruler. Jesus said to his disciples, I assure you and most solemnly say to you, it is difficult for a rich man who clings to possessions and status and security to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man who places his faith in wealth and status to enter the kingdom of God. So when the disciples heard this, they were completely astonished and bewildered because they took a look at that rich young ruler and said, well, there's a vision of how God smiles on somebody that makes him happy. He's handsome, he's smart, he's young, he's connected, and he's filthy rich. And yet Jesus is saying it's nearly impossible for that guy to get into heaven. And that freaks them out because they live in a culture that says the rich are rich because God blesses them because he likes what they're doing. And now Jesus looks at a guy who's the epitome of this and says, yeah, it's going to be almost impossible for him to get into heaven. And then they hear that, and he blows their mind every day. They think they're starting to get a handhold on this teaching, and then they're completely astonished and bewildered, and they go, well, then who can be saved from the wrath of God? Who? Who can qualify if that guy can't? And Jesus looked at them and said, with people, as far as it depends on them, like in the flesh, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And remember, he said to this guy who was disingenuous, he said to him, you know, have you followed the two main commandments? And he goes, yes, since my youth, I've done it perfectly. Nobody has, right? So he knows his heart isn't right. And so he leads him on. He goes, great job. Here's the last thing you need to do. Sell all your wealth and give it to the poor and follow me. And you're going to have eternal life guaranteed. And he walks away. He walks away because his faith and everything that gives him this confidence is in his wealth. So let's go to the second half of this section of 19. Then Peter answered him, saying, look, we have given up everything and followed you, becoming your disciples and accepting you as teacher and Lord. What then will there be for us? He's saying, look at all the sacrifice we made. We left our fishing business, our boats, our nets, our lines, our hooks, the way that we provided for our families. We walked away from all of that. There should be something great for us, right? He's talking exactly like the people who showed up at 6 a.m. and worked 12 hours. Hey, you gave the people that worked 1 hour a full day's pay? We should get 10 times a full day's pay for what we did, right? It never works, this comparison thinking. I worked harder. I did better. I achieved more. And the disciples were doing that amongst themselves. And Jesus said to them, I assure you and most solemnly say to you, in the renewal, that is the messianic restoration and regeneration of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me, becoming my disciples, will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, let's just take that section because Christians run nuts with all of this stuff. First of all, they depict Peter as being somehow way above the other disciples. Not the case. Here's Peter showing that he totally doesn't get it, right? And saying, hey, we left everything. Is there going to be something special for us? Do we get extra for doing this? Do we get credit for doing this? And Jesus says, you all are going to sit on 12 thrones, each one of them equal. Are they actually going to be sitting on thrones? I don't think so. Okay. But they will be judging as other believers will be judging. And the 12 tribes of Israel, that is the church of Christ. So how do they sit on these thrones over the church of Christ? That's actually, I believe, the New Testament. That is all written by these early disciples and then people like Paul and Timothy who come along. And let's just look at this workers in the marketplace. Peter's the first, right? He's the first one in. Paul is after Jesus is gone. And it's arguable that Paul had a more significant effect, but you never see him trying to say, I'm greater. He's always saying, yeah, I'm the least. I'm the least because I'm the persecutor. I have blood on my hands. And yet he did so much. And that New Testament is really our guide. It's our way to say, you know what? The Old Testament is amazing and it all pointed to this. But now we have the teaching of the Messiah here physically, Emmanuel, God with us. And that's just utterly amazing. And he goes, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sister or father or mother or children or farms for my name's sake will receive, this says many times as much, other translations, 100-fold. Okay, it's unbelievable what you're going to receive for that sacrifice and will inherit eternal life. You're going to spend eternity in heaven. And then he says, and this is cautionary for them, but many who are first in this world, Peter's the first disciple, will be last in the world to come, and the last first. So he says that to them in 19, but he can see they don't get it. And so they're walking along, and he puts together the workers in the vineyard to try to solve this issue because he doesn't want it to tear them apart. Who did more? Who made a greater sacrifice? Who's been at this longer? Who was closer to Jesus? Can't have any of it. You can't have any of it because, and here are some significant points, there is no system of seniority in God's kingdom. There isn't one. And there's no preferential treatment for the amount of time or effective results or the difficulty of the mission or the personal sacrifice. You don't get to weigh all that in some kind of matrix and then look over at another brother or sister and go, well, you barely made a dent. I did something huge, right? This is why we get uneasy with Donald Trump's behavior, right? He's always, no one ever did it better. No one ever did it bigger. No one, just all of that braggadocio that makes you go, whoa, wait a minute. You're doing some good things. Don't goof it up now with this. So it's not how long, but how faithfully you're walking this out. That's why the 5 o'clock people get the full benefit. They had to accept the grace of God. They didn't know what their benefit was going to be, and they did it. So it's not about the time. It's not about how much. It's not about the amount of your sacrifice. And if you start going there, and let's be honest, everybody goes there, right? I've been working so much at the church. Pastors go there. I have no time for myself. I don't have time for my family. I'm doing so many things for the church. Well, that church is in real trouble. Why? Because everybody in that church can see that going on. What do? Just stand back and take and take and take and let those people get completely destroyed by Satan, all in the name of God? That makes God happy? I don't think so. I don't think so. We're all supposed to be doing kingdom work. And that means come alongside your pastor. That means you have to see it. You have the eyes, you have the intelligence. God gives you the wisdom to see where help is required. And if you see it and go, yeah, but I'm too busy. We're going on a picnic after church. Not going to cut it. And the paymaster is going to be waiting for everybody, okay? And here's what's totally fallacious about the way most Christians see their kingdom work is that they think, you know what? I'm already overscheduled. Okay, I don't have time to do this. I can't do everything. And so I come to the church on Sunday for the service and I give money and that's all I can do. Wow, a misunderstanding of how this works. When you use your gifts, you get regenerated by it. When you use your gifts and you make that time, all of a sudden, other things in your life open up. You're starting from a premise of limitation. That's not how God operates. That's why Jesus says, well, with people, this is impossible because they'll always see the negative and then they won't want to try. He says, but with God, all things are possible. So now, verse 11, when they received it, meaning the people who came first started at 6 a.m., when they received it, they protested and grumbled at the owner of the estate. They're arguing with God. And these are many times the people who have been in the church the longest. Well, why is he being appointed an elder? I've been here for 35 years. Why does my opinion not carry more weight? My father started this church. You've heard it all. Trust me, I've heard it all. And it is always, I'm weighing myself against you, and I should have more influence than you. And so these men, actually, in most of the translations, we see what the person representing God says to them. So let's see where it goes here. These men who came last worked only 1 hour, right? They're accusing God of unfairness. And yet you have made them equal in wages to us. And that's the whole thing, right? I don't want to be equal to everybody else. I want to be above everybody else. You made them equal in wages to us who have carried the most of the burden and worked in the scorching heat of the day. But the owner of the estate replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no injustice. Do you not agree with me for a denarius? And he's right. But the word that he uses for friend here is the same word that Jesus uses to address Judas Iscariot. So it is not true friendship. It is, you're accusing me. I'm the owner. And what actually happens in most of the translations, next he says, pick up your wages, meaning they threw the wages into the dirt. And this is a depiction of what Jesus is saying. God sees the invitation he makes to us, and we just go, no thanks. I got something better going on. He says, take what belongs to you and go. In other translations, pick up what belongs to you and go. But I choose to give to this last man hired the same as I give to you. Am I not lawfully permitted to do what I choose with what is mine? And here's the slam dunk. Or is your eye envious because I am generous? Then he says, for the apostles' benefit, so those who are last in this world shall be first in the world to come, and those who are first, last. So this whole target of these people who came at 6 a.m. and are ripped that the deal they negotiated, they no longer want because somebody got the same thing for doing less work. That's all targeted at the apostles. And Jesus is saying that because their job is going to be to go out, and all of them but one are going to lose their lives, right? So they can't be thinking this way. They can't be looking and say, well, what happened to him? So Jesus wants them to cease their envy, jealousy, pettiness, their perverse and sinful judgments and ranking of themselves, and the constant jockeying and maneuvering for advantage that's at the core of the culture they come from. And honestly, it's the core of our culture. And it's absolutely destructive to the call. This inflated evaluation of themselves is an ugly part of human behavior that destroys churches and businesses and families. That cry, thou hast made them equal to us. The first made themselves last through self-importance. The last became first by trust with no contract. They were looking at the sacrifices that they made, that they walked away from their lives. They walked away from every plan that they had to do this. And now Jesus is saying that he's going to be gone. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, what kind of deal is this? Most of them assumed that he was going to take power and that they were going to be his cabinet. And they just had made that up because their culture made it up. The mother of the sons of Zebedee came and said, hey, my boys left everything that we had for them to follow you. So I hope when you come into power that they can sit on the right and the left hand, that they can be the Secretary of State and the VP. And he just goes, you know what? That's not for me to give, and you really don't understand what you're asking. And that's where he leaves them. And that's not an easy lesson because he's running out of time. So another tough lesson from Jesus, using the tool of a parable to try to make the apostles, in this case, look at themselves. Paul's whole thing was that he saw himself as the absolute best. He basically calls himself a super Jew, born into a blue blood Hebrew family, trained at the foot of Gamaliel, a Hebrew of Hebrews, he calls himself, a super Jew. Nobody had a better education. Nobody had better connections. Nobody had more social power. And yet he was 100% wrong. He had to make a 180, and he didn't make it himself. Jesus had to knock him off his horse and blind him in midday. And so he was humbled by that. And Jesus said, you know what? You have been persecuting me, meaning you've been persecuting my church. I'm going to give you an opportunity to save yourself, but it's going to be one heck of a ride. And no human could go through it, but I'm going to give you a glimpse of heaven so that you'll know the reward is worth it. But it's going to be painful. And it was. So you're right. Paul's situation is very different. And he's a prolific letter writer. And when we finish the parables, we're going to get into the letters of Paul because of that. Now we're going to finish with something different. Constantly trying to get to the truth of who our founders were. And it's almost impossible because all of the secular historians that are promoted by the secular leftist publishing houses want a rewrite of who these people are. They're either racist monster, patriarchy, or whatever, but they're definitely not God-fearing people who made huge sacrifices to give birth to our country. So here's John Quincy Adams. He is the 6th president. His father was president before him, John Adams. And this is dawn on the 1st of January. In other words, the start of the new year in 1829. And things are bleak in his home for he and his wife. And we never think this way. We see presidents and they're flying all over, and there's parties and celebrities and big meetings with world leaders and all of this. And here's another glimpse into a man who was a significant president, but his presidency is not covered. He was a believer, an ardent believer, and his wife is incredibly ill as he starts the first morning of the first day of the year 1829. He's writing in his journal by the light of an oil lamp. The year begins in gloom. My wife had a sleepless and painful night. The dawn was overcast, and as I began to write, my shaded lamp went out, self-extinguished. It was only for lack of oil, and the notice of so trivial an incident may serve but to mark the present temper of my mind. But in good or in evil fortune, It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Let him look to the fountain of all good. Let him consult the oracles of God. I began the year with prayer, and then, turning to my Bible, read the first Psalm. It affirms that the righteous man is, and promises that he shall be, blessed. This is comfort and consolation, and points in general terms to the path of duty. May the light of this lamp never forsake me. And he's not talking about his oil. He's talking about the light of Jesus Christ.